Your Excellency, Mr. President, it is a great honor to welcome you to Maqsut Narikbayev University. Tervetuloa, Herr Presidenti. Today is a special occasion for our students who have the privilege to engage directly with you. As a leader whose rich experience in national governance, European policy, and international cooperation continues to inspire young minds and scholars around the world. Dear students, I encourage you to make the most of this opportunity to ask questions, to listen, and to take inspiration from this dialogue. I'm confident that moments like this help shape the way young leaders think, act, and imagine the future based on knowledge, openness, and mutual understanding. Mr. President, thank you once again for being with us today and for your readiness to share your ideas and perspective with our students. Thank you. And now I'm giving the floor to Christopher Holt, please.
Mr. President, thank you very much indeed for finding time during your busy schedule to visit us today at MNU. I know we all, and especially the students, have been very excited indeed to see you and to listen to your speech and to give you some questions today. Now, for the students and the guests, Mr. President, if I may, President Stubbs requires no introduction. Safe to say, for anybody who has just landed on planet Earth from another planet, that President Stubb has been the President of Finland since March 2024. He was previously the Prime Minister of Finland and has held numerous senior posts, including as Minister of Finance, leader of the National Coalition Party, Minister of the European Affairs and Trade, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vice President of the European Investment Bank, and of course Director and Professor of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute. Now today, very briefly if I may, the balance of power in the international system appears to be moving from an order that has been largely unipolar to what now appears to be increasingly a more assertive multipolar world. Nations are recalibrating foreign policies and weighing traditional interests. Increasingly, power of emerging states and non-state actors, technological disruption, and challenges to global institutions, increasingly global competition, makes balancing interests increasingly complex and unpredictable. Mr. President, we very much look forward to listening to your speech, the changing balance of power, values, interests, and power in foreign policy. May I invite you to give your speech, Mr. President? Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you also, all of you, for being here today. I'll try to take about 20 minutes of your time to basically lay out where I see the world going in the middle of the 2020s, so in 2025. And I'd be really glad to take questions more spontaneously than prepared. I'll be basing what I'm saying pretty much on a book which I was writing for 5 years. It's called The Triangle of Power, Rebalancing the New World Order. And it's coming out in English in January. In Finnish, we already published it, albeit it was written actually in English. But of course, a book comes out at a certain time and thinking develops. And I'll certainly give a slightly different twist to it. And what I'll do is I'll give you an introduction, and then I'll make 3 points, and then I will try to conclude. And by way of introduction, I'd like to say that foreign policy is quite often based on 3 pretty classical pillars: values, interests, and power. And the difference here is that smaller players or mid-sized powers like Kazakhstan, Finland, we have values and interests, but we actually have limited power. Power is something that is quite often in the hands of big states. It can be economic power, it can be military power, so by definition it can be hard power or soft power or smart power. So what we can do in between is to try to maximize our influence. Now, for a state, interests and values are often the basis, and they are defined by your geographic location. They're defined by your resources and capacity. They are defined by who you form your alliances with. And of course, there are about 200 nation states in the world, so you can imagine, South Africa has a different view on the world than, say, Sweden, or Kyrgyzstan has a different view to, say, Thailand. But the bottom line is that quite often we play with these three things: values, interests, and power. And let me try then to explain where I see the world going in 2025. And I'll do it by first saying a few words on order. What is the world order right now? Second, what is the balance? And three, what are the dynamics? And from there, I'll then derive and try to summarize where I see values, interests, and power going. Now, number one, order. You begin your studies or are studying at a moment of disorder. And I actually began my studies at a moment of disorder as well. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, and then of course in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and for instance, Kazakhstan retained its nationhood again. And in a moment of disorder, you quite often feel quite desperate because something that used to exist doesn't exist anymore. And you felt that there was a clear order. So the way in which we quite often try to explain it is to say that the Cold War was bipolar. You had the Soviet Union versus the United States. So communism and collective economies versus capitalism and democracy, right? It was bipolar. And then you were either on the Soviet side or the American side, or then you were neutral in between. Of course, when the Cold War ended, we went to the next order, which was unipolar, which you just mentioned. So there was only one undisputed superpower in the world, and that was the United States. It had the military might. It had just won the Cold War, at least from an ideological perspective. And many of us, myself included, when I was studying at your age, I thought that, Fukuyama, end of history, every one of the 200 nation states in the world will convert towards a combination of liberal democracy, social market economy, and globalization, and we will live happily ever after. Well, of course, there's no such thing as end of history, or there's no such thing as stagnant foreign policy or diplomacy or international relations. There's no end state. There's no end state in diplomacy. It's always a process, and you have to nurture and work on that process. So sometime perhaps around 9/11, or the financial crisis in 2008, or Russia's attack on Georgia, or annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, or Brexit, or whatever date you want to choose, this order started to change. And suddenly we moved from a world that used to be bipolar to a world that was unipolar, and now suddenly multipolar. So you have big players and mid-sized players basically finding their own space. China emerges. Other big players start challenging American unipolarity or hegemony. We in the West believed that everyone would, be like us, want to be like us. And then suddenly we realized, that wasn't really the case. There was talk about the BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and many other different players that emerge. So suddenly now we are in a world which is multipolar and therefore, by definition, quite messy. And for you, I'd like to say that this is kind of the 1918, 1945, or 1989 moment of our generation or your generation. So it's a moment when the world order changes, right? We can get it wrong, as they did after World War I. You remember the League of Nations was a nice idea, a Wilsonian idea of 14 points, which the Americans then didn't go in with, but nevertheless, it was a nice idea. But the League of Nations wasn't strong enough to contain big power competition, and we ended up in World War II. Or we could get it more or less right, as the leaders did after World War II, with the establishment of the United Nations, with all of its deficiencies and all of its power structures. But, you know, we haven't had a world war since the end of World War II. Or we could become intellectually lazy and assumptive, as we were after the Cold War, when we thought that everyone was going to just live happily ever after. There would be green fields and peace signs and rainbows and eternal growth and development and sustainability and the rest of it. The choice is between multipolar transactionalism or multilateral cooperation. Of course, this is a simplification, but the bottom line is you have to ask yourselves the question, what works better? Transactions and deals, or multilateral fora, international institutions, rules and norms? That's essentially the tension that we have. And here we come to my second point, which is balance. Now, this is obviously a simplification, but you know, in books and in thinking, when you try to framework things, it's always quite useful to try to simplify. My simplification is that we now have a triangle of power where you have the global West, the global East, and the global South. The global West is led, at least so far, by the United States. It has about 50 of the 200 nation states of the world, so including North America, Europe, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia. And this group, fairly unified, but quite complex, wants to maintain the current world order, right? So it still believes that the system that was created after World War II is functional. There is, of course, one question mark. Does the United States still believe in multilateral institutions? Like the UN, like the WTO, like the WHO, like the IMF, like the World Bank, which were all created right after World War II. I think the jury is out, and we'll have to see. On the other side, you have the global East, which is led by China, followed by Russia, and more or less 22, 23 countries that quite often vote with China and Russia in the United Nations. They are not a unified bunch, you know, Iran, North Korea, Russia, not necessarily, but they have one thing in common. They don't like Western dominance. So they don't like the fact that the United States has dominated international institutions. They don't like the fact that the West has quite often been judgmental about their way of life. And of course, in the middle of this East versus West is a tension between the United States and China. Not for world hegemony, but kind of for a world balance. And that's what makes it quite complicated. And you have to, as students, ask yourself the question, who is winning right now? Is it the United States with tariffs, for instance? Or is it China with a rather different type of approach? Because this then has ramifications on the third balance, which is the global South. And I'm, of course, already apologetic, and I say it's a simplification to lump 125 countries together. But my big thesis is that it's actually going to be the global South that decides what the next world order looks like. It's going to be emerging powers such as India, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, who are sometimes a part of the global West and sometimes a part of the global East, but very much have an identity of their own as global South. They're the ones who are going to decide, do we tilt the world towards multipolarity, which I would argue that at least China tries to push for, or multilateralism, which I would argue the European Union, for instance, tries to push for. So this is the interesting balance. And what we as political scientists have to ask is, okay, how do you impact this? And for me, it comes down to the way in which you assess the world and the way in which you behave towards the other. This is I have values and interests, but I don't have power, but I can have an influence. And that means that I, of course, as a multilateralist coming from a small country, I want to influence the global south and tell them, listen, you're much better off with rules and norms and international institutions than transactions. So that's the balance that we're playing with. And then we come to my third and final point before I conclude, which is dynamics. So if we have a world order, which is in disorder, if we have a world balance, which is tilting between the east, west, and south, what are the dynamics that are then going to, drive this forward? What's going to happen? Again, sorry for the simplicity, 3 not necessarily mutually exclusive alternatives, but nevertheless, competition, conflict, and cooperation. So what we have to understand is that there is constant global competition between states. And that competition is quite often based on simple things. Technology. Who can dominate in the field of technology? Or military. Who has the biggest military capability? So one being soft power, the other one being hard power. Or just simple economic development. So who is the one who can create a system conducive of development? So competition is important, and there's also an additional element to competition, resources, whether it's critical minerals or other natural resources. Now, competition is good, I don't deny that, because that sort of drives us forward, right? But the problem is that if you don't contain competition, and if you don't have rules, it can very easily become the second, in other words, conflict. And what we have seen in the 2000s is an increase in conflicts. First, they used to be just local, kind of civil wars, right? Whether it's in Africa or in the Middle East, or even, in Europe. But then they became regional. So Palestine and Israel, or Israel and Iran, or Russia and Ukraine. So they've kind of spilt over into bigger conflicts. And the worst thing, of course, would be that they would become global. So that's what we're trying to work on, that it wouldn't happen. And my argument is that if we continue a multipolar world, where it's kind of dog eats dog, where it's the power of the big, or whether it's a transaction, then we're not going to get a lasting peace. We're going to see an increase in conflicts. And that's what we're trying to contain. So therefore, we need the third dynamic, which is cooperation. And in the cooperative framework, the question is the cooperation bilateral? And as much as I love bilateral relations between Finland and Kazakhstan, but let's be honest, that's not going to save world peace, right? I mean, it's great that we do business. It's great that we have important security political discussions with President Tokayev, but alone we can't do this, right? Or they can be plurilateral, which is basically getting a few more countries into the system and having alliances. The BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or AUKUS, which is Australia, the UK, and the United States, or the Quad, which is India, Japan, and the United States. These are quite useful, but at the end of the day, it's rules within rules for small players. Or then, finally, we can do this all together and have some kind of multilateral system. So I'll conclude by saying that on the 3 things that I outlined in the beginning, values, interests, and power, I personally think that values are universal. Human rights, fundamental rights, protection of minorities, freedom, rule of law, or values in international relations like independence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty. Those are fundamental values which we should believe in. But the problem is that interests are not universal in the same kind of a way. Finland has different interests to Kazakhstan, albeit there are some similarities as well. But the bottom line is that how do you make a match between the values that are universal and the interests that we have in different parts of the globe, security, economic, or otherwise? And here is where we come to the final thing that, okay, if the values should be the same, how do you bring the interests together without us going to a world of power where the big ones basically tell us what to do? I don't have an answer. I admit that, because I don't think there are any finite answers in international relations. But I do have an inkling. I think it usually takes about a decade for an order to emerge. It did so after World War I, it did so after World War II, and it did so after the Cold War. So you are going to be studying at a time when the world is in flux, when there is a disorder, where the balance is changing and where the dynamics are shifting. Secondly, I think that out of this disorder will eventually come some kind of an order. You know, are we going to tilt towards democracy or autocracy? Are we going to tilt towards multipolarity or multilateralism? Are we going to tilt towards small players or common rules or big powers? We don't know yet, but some order will emerge out of this. And then finally, I think that what we do now in the next 5 to 10 years will probably determine more or less what the order will look like for this century. This could be a wrong statement, because I'm sure that there were political scientists in 1925 saying that we have created an order through the League of Nations and this will last until the end of the century. But the bottom line is that I think that this should and could stabilize the situation. History rarely repeats itself, but sometimes it does rhyme. So this is what I wanted to say to kick off the discussion, to say that foreign policy is about values, interests, and power, and to say that we're witnessing a change in order, in balance, and in dynamics. And my final point is that I know that you're young students, but each and every one of you have agency. And by agency, I mean to say that you have a voice and try to tilt the world towards a better direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. Thank you. Now, I think if Mr. President will allow us, we'd like to ask, not me, the students would like to ask a series of questions. I know that students have been, yes, already, hands are up. We've got about 25 minutes, I believe, for questions. And with your permission, Mr. President, we'll just take a few from around the room in no particular order. So this gentleman here with the white top, if you'd like to ask your question. And again, just to remind everybody, please introduce yourselves and then ask your question. Thank you.
Mr. President, thank you for giving me this opportunity to ask a question. My name is Kurmahan Ismail. I'm second-year student in international law. How Finland apply effective consultation and free prior informed consent? Thank you.
Sure. It's obviously a big question for those of you who are not specialists in the situation of the Sami people in Finland. You'll know that we've had a very long parliamentary process in trying to settle complicated issues which have to do with the consultation of minorities, in this particular case, the Sami people. I can only speak for myself, not for the government, but there are two observations I want to make. What I tried to do straight off when I began my term about a year and 8 months ago was to visit not only Lapland, but the Sami people. And I also paid a visit to their parliament to be able to understand the issues at stake. And my second point is more or less better news. There has been some legislation that we've tried to push in Finland for I don't know how many different governments, but they have now reached an end state and a compromise. So I think you will see some good news on this front. One thing I do want to say that foreign policy is never perfect. You know, you have to make a value judgment every day, and I do not know of one country in the world which is 100% consistent in what it says and what it does. But in this particular question, I hope and believe that Finland is going in a better direction.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We'll take one more question for now from the centre, and then we'll move out to the sides. The lady on the front in the black jacket, please. Again, please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. It's an honor to meet you here today. My name is Jazira Karataeva. I am a third-year student of Applied Linguistics. So half a year ago, European Commission published that starting from August of 2026, Finland is planning on providing general upper secondary education in English language, in addition to Finnish and Swedish. So my question is, with implementation of English to the system, what ways would be taken to balance global openness and at the same time safeguard Finnish and Swedish as national languages? Thank you.
Very good. I think you're a little bit outside of my, how would I say, constitutional competence. But as a person who has been raised in a bilingual family, Finnish and Swedish. So I spoke Finnish with my mother and Swedish with my dad and Finnish with my brother. And I started in a Finnish school and swapped over to a Swedish school. And as someone who is now married to a person who was born in the United Kingdom and now has dual nationality, and we live in a household where I speak Swedish to the kids and English, and my wife speaks English to the kids, I can only give you a general view. Our curricula in Finland obviously starts from two languages, Finnish and Swedish. The curricula and the whole education system, I think, on a lower level is very functional because it gives a lot of autonomy to the teachers to teach a certain curriculum, which the rector was mentioning here at the university as well. And I have always been a fan of curricula which focus a lot on languages. So when I started studying, my first foreign language was English, and then we moved on to German and French and so on and so forth. I don't know about the particular legislation that you mentioned, but what I do know is that when our family moved from Belgium to Finland, our kids wanted to do their primary and secondary education in English, and that was possible. So in Finland there are schools that actually teach the same curricula but in English, and that seemed to have worked quite well. Final point is that, you know, the Kazakh language is spoken about 20 million people, roughly speaking. Finnish is spoken by 5.6 million. So if you want to expand your horizons, the more languages you learn, the better off you will be.
Thank you very much. Right, turning to the left, this lady here, please. Would you like to ask your question?
Good afternoon, Mr. President. My name is Diana Abilkhanova. I am a second-year international law student. So during your time in the European Parliament, you emphasized that the European Union is a community of values based on equality, human rights, and social justice. So my question is, how has your experience in promoting the Lisbon Treaty emphasized your understanding of economic and social justice in the Union? Thank you.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if I may, I'll give a more serious note and then a lighter note. I'll begin with the lighter note. I'm a little bit of an EU nerd, so I basically had my academic awakening in the United States, studying international relations and the European Union. And my DNA has been very much, as a Finn, to integrate Finland into the European Union. I was happy when we became members in '95, and I wanted to be a professor of European integration. But what I've learned during my years, not only as an academic, but probably more likely as a practitioner, is that the European Union always advances in 3 stages. Stage number 1 is crisis. Stage number 2 is chaos. And stage number 3 is suboptimal solution. So I think we live in an imperfect world, and that's my more sort of serious point. The problem, I think, with students of European integration is that there's quite often an ideological pretext. And what we fail to understand that, again, the European Union is not an end state. It's not a finalité. It's more than an international organization, but it's less than a state. And that, by definition, makes it suboptimal because there are competencies that belong very strongly to the nation state. And then, of course, we have pooled sovereignty enough to understand that there are competencies that are exclusive to the European Union, like, for instance, trade or customs or monetary policy. And then we come to the big question of human rights, fundamental rights, and social rights. They are framed in Article 2 of the European Union. And then it's a question of, do all member states at all times follow? And if they don't follow, what do you do? So there have been, for instance, challenges based on Article 7, if I remember correctly, towards Poland with the previous government, towards Hungary with the current government, that challenge that are you following the rules which are linked to, say, freedom of speech or independence of the judiciary system, etc., etc. But what I want to say with my answer in very short is that I think the aims and values of the European Union are noble, but I will never make a claim that they are followed every and each day. For that, of course, you have the European Court in Luxembourg that makes the final judgment.
Thank you very much. We'll take one more question from here and then we'll move to the other side, please. The lady here, please, with the hand up. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. My name is Dania Jankina. I'm final year student majoring in psychology. And as a psychology student, I'm interested in one concept in Finland, that sisu, which means inner strength and resilience. And Mr. President, I'm interested, how do you apply this philosophy to stay composed during the times of personal or political pressure? Thank you.
Yeah, my daughter just finished her thesis in psychology as well, so I get a lot of these questions at home. You know, I mean, it's difficult to give, you know, a very precise answer. But I do think that resilience, either personal or societal, is a key element and construct. And I think in Finland, actually, we have a very special word for it. It's called sisu, which is about perseverance, grit, and resilience. How do you cope with a situation which is complicated or where you feel very pressured? Two answers. On a societal level, I think we're trying to find a balance whereby, you know, we believe in the basic values of equality and opportunity and freedom and so on and so forth. But if someone in society feels that they're not able to cope with a certain situation, society in a welfare state should be able to grab you and help you. I'm not saying it happens perfectly. It's very uneven, but that's the basic philosophy. On a personal level, it's hard to say, and of course the question is very personal. But I've found in my own life that, you know, I have a few things that I try to deal with when I have hard times. And for me, it's basically having the basic framework right, which means that you have a good network of family and friends with whom you can have trustworthy conversations. Paradoxically, there are also other things which I think just have to do with your basic capacity to switch off. You know, I have to understand that, you know, I, much like any human being, am imperfect and I make mistakes. And when I make mistakes, I kind of have to be able to understand that they are part of life and move on. So I quite rarely dwell on something that, okay, you know, I shouldn't have said that or I shouldn't have done that. I quite often say, okay, you know, I made a mistake, that's it, move on, admit it. And if you want to frame it very simply, I think the hardest time in my life was from 2014 to 2016 when I was party chairman, prime minister, and finance minister in a difficult situation. And that's where I really, you know, learned a lot about myself and how to cope with stress, strain, and pressure. And once I got through that really difficult patch, I think I've been able to cope with my own mistakes and failures much better. And my final point is to say that under pressure, the key is to have a really good team around you. And I feel that I have that because they give me then confidence to get through hell and high water.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you. I'd like to invite a question from this side, please.
Sure.
In particular, if there are any questions relevant to the speech of His Excellency the President
it doesn't matter.
today
You can
as
ask
well.
about anything. Don't worry about it.
Maybe the lady at the front, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. President. First of all, welcome to Kazakhstan and to our university. My name is Dana. I'm third-year international relations student. And one of the core ideas of your recent UN General Assembly speeches was about reformation of the United Nations, specifically adding more voices to Security Council, 2 voices to Africa, to Asia, and for Latin America. And also you emphasized that no single state should hold a veto power. So in today's, as you mentioned, world full of conflicting and competing interests, do you believe that this reform is objectively and realistically achievable? Isn't it a political utopia, and how the international community should work to achieve this goal? Thank you.
I posed a difficult question. No, thanks for having listened or read the speech. I actually developed this idea a little bit further in a foreign affairs article, which will be published in January, in the January-February issue. And the working title of the article is The Last Chance for the West. And my argument there is very similar, that if we don't reform the international institutions that are the basis for the multilateral system, then they will not last. Whether my view is objective, I don't know. Realistic, probably not. But I think it's important to push out ideas there. And for those of you who haven't followed the ideas, the idea would be that if you want to maintain the United Nations as the core international institution to maintain peace, stability, and security, it needs to be reformed so as to give agency to those players that didn't have agency in 1945. And agency means that you have power, or you have a word, or you have a vote. And I make 3 proposals. One is to double the size of the Security Council from 5 to 10. And as you mentioned, 1 from Latin America, 2 from Africa, and 2 from Asia. My second proposal is to remove the veto power of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, because that, in my mind, has incapacitated the work of the Security Council. And my third proposal is to withdraw the voting right of a country in the Security Council or elsewhere who is violating the UN Charter. So that would then create a new balance in the system. You can imagine that when I gave that speech, out of the 193 members in the United Nations, I would say that 188 applauded and 5 were silent. So that probably then that shows you the realism of it. But I think we need to do that. I mean, if you're India, the most populated country in the world, or if you're South Africa, or if you're Nigeria, or if you're Brazil, you have to wonder, why don't I have a permanent seat in the UN Security Council? So, I hope that reform will take place, and we'll see how realistic my suggestions are.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Let's have one more question, please, from this side. I'm going to go to the back this time, I think. The lady there in the grey top, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Your Excellency, welcome to Kazakhstan. Thank you for your fruitful speech, for your thoughts. My name is Indira Amanova. I'm a third-year student, also majoring in international relations. And as someone who is just entering her 20s, and I believe many of us feel the same, I'm truly curious about how leaders found the duty to devote their lives to politics. So my question is a bit personal and reflective. What was your motivation at our age to choose a career in public service and remain committed to it? So now we see you as the president of Finland that is greatly admired internationally. Thank you.
Thanks. It's a really good question, and I'm always quite sort of honest and blunt about it. When I was young, I had absolutely no aspirations to have societal impact. I wanted to become first a professional ice hockey player, but my dad was a talent scout and he saw that I would never become one. And then I wanted to become a professional golfer. And that was the reason, that was the academic reason I went to the United States to study. And I wanted to study economics. I wanted to basically become a professional golfer and get a business degree, right? And in the first year, I noticed I'm not going to become professional. I'm not good enough. And economics is not my thing, but I love international relations. And that changed my life. And I was 21, because I had done my military service in Finland and we start school a little bit later and the rest of it. So I kind of woke up to things academic only at the age of 21. And then there's a funny kind of an anecdote, because this was still at a time where, bachelor's degree wasn't much in Finland, right? So I had really studied as hard as I could. I mean, around the clock, I got my straight A's and I got a nice recognition and Phi Beta Kappa and the rest of it, and because I felt I was catching up. And then I was very proud and I called the Finnish educational authorities. I said, listen, I have this bachelor's in political science. What is it worth in Finland? And I got this bureaucrat at the end of the, well, in Finland we don't have any bachelors, but perhaps at the Helsinki University they might give you a couple of courses. So from that moment on, I decided, okay, if that's his approach, I'm going to get a master's and a PhD in the Anglo-Saxon system. So that sort of changed my life. And for a long time, I really only wanted to become an academic. I wanted to teach. But then at some stage, I felt that there was a discrepancy between theory and practice, that I really wanted to test what practice was. And that's probably a recommendation that I give to all of you, that the academic framework is very useful, but especially in international relations, if you don't have the experience as a civil servant or in politics or something like that, you might not get the full picture. So I went and did civil service and finished my PhD. I was working at the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs and the European Commission and others. And then sometime around 2003, I thought, I can't say exactly what I think. In academia, I can do that. But as a civil servant, I can't. So I thought, why don't I do European politics? So I ran for the European Parliament. And that was my awakening, 2003, 2004. But my thinking at the time was, I want to make Finland European. That was my big thing there, right? And I thought, okay, I'll be in the European Parliament. That's it. But then I was called in, because of a scandal of my predecessor, to become foreign minister of Finland. I had 24 hours to decide. And we lived in Brussels, everything was good and happy. And it's the kind of a question you get once in your lifetime. And then I ended up becoming foreign minister, and then one thing led to another. But my message here is to all of you. I mean, if you have a calling to have an impact in international relations or, here in Kazakhstan, have an open mind. Have a curious mind. And then also understand that things that you expect happening will not happen. That sometimes in life, it's about, yes, hard work, but at other times, it's purely about luck. You happen to be in the right time, the right place. This is just a message to say that follow your heart, be open, understand that in life you will have many failures. But there's one final thing I want to tell you, and that is a lot of people in today's world try to define success. And all of you are young here. Success is not about your salary. it's not about your societal status. It's not about a title, president or prime minister or professor. For me, it's about meaning. And meaning comes from the fact that you do something in your life which you feel that almost every day is meaningful. And for me, meaning doesn't come from power. You know, I'm very fortunate to be in a position of power, but that's not it. It's about how I use that power. And I feel that meaning comes not from promoting or doing things for yourself, but for helping someone else. And if you keep that in mind, I think no matter what happens, and when we meet up again in 40 years, you will have had a good life.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I think we might just have time for one more question,
Sure.
with your permission, Mr. President. Thank you.
Usually I have an aide de camp who stands up, tells me when it's time to go.
Yeah.
I haven't seen him, so keep him hidden behind a pole.
Let's have one more if we may. I can see the pressure building over here. Why don't we have one more question then from the lady at the back with her hand. Your hand is highest, so why don't we go to you, please? Yes, please. Thank you. And I'm sorry to everybody else, but time is short.
Mr. President, we would like to express our sincerest gratitude for your inspiring speech. My name is Harsinyan Anna, and I'm a second-year student of international law. Back in 2021, Finland's fossil fuel use was approximately 36%, and it is a half of the 70% of another International Energy Agency members, which is very impressive and reflects Finland's goal to reach full carbon neutrality by the 2035, which are effective technologies and forward-looking approaches. My question is, how bilateral cooperation will accelerate implementation of that technologies in Kazakhstan's green transition? Thank you very much.
It's difficult to me, you know, to take issue with Kazakhstan's green transition. But one of the 6 or 7 points that your president mentioned in his speech at the business conference yesterday was green transition. I can only say what I personally think. First of all, I think we now have a problem in the sense that climate change seems to be on the back burner of the international agenda, because we're so focused on conflicts right now. And, you know, we're focused on a new American administration, President Trump, we're focused on Ukraine, Russia, we're focused on Israel, Palestine. So suddenly people don't remember that climate change is the biggest existential threat that we have. I, by the way, fly from here to Helsinki. I land there on Saturday night, and on Tuesday I fly to Brazil, where there is the climate conference COP30 to discuss these types of issues. My second observation is that usually in order to solve the climate crisis, it's not binary, black and white. You need at least 3 things. Number one is you need legislation. So that's kind of goals and targets that you set. Finland carbon neutral 2035. I'm not going to take issue whether that's going to happen or not, but it's an aim. And that is then supported by both national and European legislation, which is good. Second, you need finance. In other words, you need public money and you need private money to get the third thing, which is innovation. Because my bottom line is that you cannot legislate yourself out of the climate crisis, so by setting targets. You cannot finance yourself out of the climate crisis. But what you can do is innovate yourself out of the climate crisis. So the question is, how do you start reducing fossil fuels? And there, again, I think diversity is the key. There will be a transition period. Finland has been able to go not carbon neutral yet, but for instance, on electricity production, over 90% of it is clean. So we've used nuclear, we've used renewables, etc., etc. And we have to continue to do that. It's going to take time. I fully understand that. I think countries in the global south need to be compensated, because there is a legitimate argument coming from them saying that, listen, you created your economic wealth and welfare on fossil fuels. Why can't we do the same? So we have to try to work on this together. But my big worry right now is that climate change is on the back burner. We need to start bringing it back before it's too late.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.